Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Subcommittee on Water, Oceans, and Wildlife. We will now call the subcommittee to order. We're meeting today to hear testimony on two bills, the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act and the Recovering America's Wildlife Act. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements are limited to the chairman, the ranking member, the vice chair, and the vice-ranking member. This allows us to hear from our witnesses sooner and helps keep members on schedule. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they're submitted to the subcommittee clerk by 5 p.m. today or the close of the hearing, whichever comes first. Hearing no objection, it is so ordered. Therefore, I also ask unanimous consent for today's bill sponsors, Representative Don Beyer of Virginia and Representative Jeff Fortenberry of Nebraska, who I believe will be joining us shortly, and Representative Debbie Dingell, of course, all of Michigan. We ask that all of them be allowed to sit and participate from the dais for today's proceedings. Hearing no objection, that too is so ordered. I want to begin by thanking Representative Dingell and Representative Beyer for being here to testify on what I believe are two important and very good pieces of legislation that would create much-needed wildlife corridors in one case and boost funding to recover our nation's wildlife in the other. Thanks for sharing your leadership on this issue and for sponsoring these bills. In this subcommittee, we have spoken extensively about the significant threats facing many wildlife species, including habitat loss and fragmentation, pollution, and of course, climate change. All of this is adding up to what is being described as a sixth mass extinction of life on Earth. Top scientists are reporting that 1 in 8 species faces extinction. 29% of the birds in America are already gone. 40% of America's freshwater fish are now rare or imperiled. These facts are devastating. Now, Americans care deeply about wildlife, and they're looking to us to fix this. While species losses may seem insurmountable, it would be wildly irresponsible for us to simply throw up our hands and give up. We wouldn't be doing our job, certainly in this subcommittee, if we did not take this opportunity to propose some big and bold science-based initiatives to address this crisis. And that's why today we are considering the Recovering America's Wildlife Act and the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act. With 122 co-sponsors and strong bipartisan support, Representative Dingell and Fortenberry and their RAWA Act, if I could use the acronym, they're leading the way for wildlife solutions. This bill would amend the Pittman-Robertson Wildlife Restoration Act, which directs funds derived from an excise tax on guns and ammunition toward the conservation of hunting species. It provides $1.4 billion per year to assist states, territories, and tribes in their efforts to conserve, restore, and protect wildlife and habitat. This bill would broaden that program significantly. And it's the kind of investment that's critically needed right now if we're to make a dent in the extinction crisis. I believe it's a good bill, and it can become a better bill as we move forward. And so I hope we will have a serious conversation about examining the amount of funding set aside for threatened and endangered species recovery. This bill is, after all, our best opportunity to both prevent new species from being listed under the ESA and also to boost listed species that are desperately in need of recovery. There's so many species in need of support for recovery, but unfortunately the ESA is chronically underfunded. Even with that problem, it's done an excellent job preventing extinction of 99% of the species listed. But this is our chance to support the ESA and further the cause of wildlife conservation. The other bill we're considering is Representative Beyer's Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act, which would create a national wildlife corridor system that would map and preserve wildlife corridors, assist states and tribes in integrating corridors into infrastructure planning, and those are all very good ideas. Depending on where you live, you may be familiar with the consistent migratory patterns of wildlife, and for me, that includes migrations like that of the humpback whale, which travels from the poles to the tropics along the Pacific coast, or the brant geese that travel from the Pacific, that travel throughout the Pacific Flyway. These are just a few examples of great migrations that happen every year. Many more land mammals and birds follow regular migratory routes across the continental U.S., as they've been doing for eons. That is, until an interstate highway or a ranch or a shopping mall blocks their way. This is a hazard for both wildlife and humans, especially on roads, because passengers in cars that collide with wildlife are also at significant risk, especially when you think about encountering something like a 1,000-pound moose. So the concept of wildlife corridors is something that we've only recently begun to understand, but we know that maintaining natural wildlife corridors or constructing new ones is a twofer. It will allow wildlife to cross over man-made structures and help them safely migrate, but will also reduce collisions on the road and help keep people safer. Establishing these corridors can help us combat the extinction crisis, too. A paper published in September in the journal Science shows that increasing habitat connectivity can boost biodiversity. So as we move forward with this groundbreaking, forward-looking legislation, I must continue to point out that the Trump administration is busy dismantling our nation's bedrock wildlife protections at every turn, whether it's removing protections for threatened species, shrinking critical habitat to allow oil and gas drilling on public lands, or requiring economic considerations to be part of the calculus in listing endangered species. They seem to never run out of ideas to make things worse, and we are going to keep fighting back when it comes to that. However, I am glad that we have a witness from the administration today to talk about these two bills where I think we have a chance to work together and make a positive impact. Lastly, it is encouraging that we're considering two wildlife bills with strong bipartisan support. No matter what your politics, whether you're a hunter or an angler, or a bird watcher, or a hiker, we all should want to help imperiled species thrive. And with these bills, we can take an important step forward toward that goal. With that, I yield my time and invite the ranking member to give his remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The subcommittee today meets to hear two bills that feed the left's insatiable demand for more land and more taxpayer earnings. They raise two critical questions. First, the federal government currently controls 640 million acres, or 28% of the entire land mass of the United States, mostly concentrated in the West. For example, it controls just 0.3% of Connecticut, but 79.6% of Nevada. And it's proven itself to be a neglectful landlord. Our federal lands currently suffer from a $20 billion backlog of deferred maintenance, while our forests have become morbidly overgrown through decades of willful neglect. It's often possible to see the border between federal and private lands by the condition of the forests themselves. In short, we failed miserably to take care of the land that we already control. A few years ago, the Subcommittee on Federal Lands held a hearing in North Las Vegas that is surrounded by vacant land as far as the eye can see. The crisis facing the community? A critical land shortage. Second, the federal government is now running a $1.2 trillion deficit, and it's not a revenue problem. Our revenues grew 4% last year. The deficit is driven by spending, which has grown twice as fast as the revenues have. This is a level at which many economists warn that we are courting a debt crisis. Interest alone on that debt is the fastest growing component of the federal budget and currently consumes roughly $400 billion just to rent the money that we've already spent. Against this backdrop, we consider two bills. H.R. 2795 would create a new mechanism for the acquisition of vast sections of land under the guise of expanding wildlife corridors. Despite the fact that the Constitution gives Congress sole authority over the public lands, this bill surrenders that authority to designate and acquire land to the executive agencies. H.R. 3742 would expand the Pittman-Robertson Wildlife Restoration Act, which is currently funded by fishing and hunting licenses, by adding a $2 billion a year authorization for direct taxpayer funding. Think of that as another $16 from an average American tax-paying family. H.R. 2795 is predicated on the assumption that human and wildlife use of the land is incompatible, despite thousands of years of experience to the contrary. In pursuit of this faulty assumption, it would vastly expand federal land holdings and impose severe restrictions on productive use of that land. I say it's a faulty assumption because our own experience informs us that pipelines and other critical infrastructure are perfectly compatible with flourishing wildlife populations. The pictures you see on the monitors show bears using a pipeline in Alaska to navigate treacherous terrain and herds grazing in the shadows of similar pipelines in other regions. Wildlife corridors do not require the heavy hand of federal bureaucrats to administer. In November of 2018, then Secretary Zinke signed Secretarial Order 3362, which explicitly aims to protect migration corridors through greater coordination with states and private landowners. For example, the Elbow Fish and Game Club in northern Pennsylvania and the Anadarko Petroleum Corporation have nurtured a partnership between wildlife and natural gas transportation. According to an analysis of the Whitetail Institute of North America, trail cameras along the pipeline have shown that deer are using the right-of-way as a food source and travel corridor. The analysis has stated that the tree clearing to establish the right-of-way has allowed sunlight to stimulate undergrowth that has lent itself as a habitat to rabbits and songbirds. H.R. 3742 creates yet another taxpayer-funded wildlife conservation program. However, unlike the Pittman-Robertson Wildlife Restoration Act, which this legislation amends, the Recovering America's Wildlife Act does not adhere to the successful beneficiary pays principle. Rather, this legislation simply raids the U.S. Treasury by mandating annual transfers of nearly $2 billion annually in perpetuity. The bill's proponents obviously recognize how fiscally irresponsible this is because instead of even a pretense of identifying offsetting cost savings, they've simply exempted themselves from congressional pay-go requirements. As of Sunday morning, more than 150,000 acres in my home state of California have burned to the ground in yet another deadly wildfire season. 100,000 people were forced to evacuate their homes. Last week, utilities cut power to 34 California counties, often for days at a time. I would ask my Democratic colleagues to stop wasting this committee's time appeasing their environmental supporters and start working on real reforms that will actually protect habitat and save lives. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd ask unanimous consent to enter into the hearing record two documents received by the subcommittee, a statement for the record submitted by the Property and Environmental Research Center, and a letter co-signed by the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, the Public Lands Council, and the American Sheep Industry Association, all in opposition to H.R. 2795, the National Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act.
Without objection. I will now recognize Representative Dingell, who will start things off by telling us about the Recovering America's Wildlife Act. You're recognized for 5 minutes, Congresswoman Dingell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member McClintock, for convening this hearing and being willing to discuss bipartisan legislation to address the biodiversity crisis in our country. We're in the midst of an unprecedented biodiversity crisis. Without a change in the way that we finance fish and wildlife conservation, the list of federally threatened and endangered species will grow from nearly 1,600 species today to thousands more in the future. Just last month, we've discovered that the number of birds in the United States and Canada has fallen by 29% since 1970, a decline of 3 billion fewer total birds. These developments threaten our common environmental heritage, reduce opportunities for outdoor recreation, and will require costly and aggressive emergency room measures under the Endangered Species Act if we don't address them. And I, like you, want to keep that from having to happen. The cost of inaction is immense. The longer we wait to address this issue, the more resources we will ultimately need to safeguard our nation's wildlife and environment. And that's why the Recovering America's Wildlife Act is necessary. The legislation provides $1.4 billion in dedicated annual funding to the states, territories, and Native American tribes for proactive conservation efforts for the 12,000 species of wildlife and plants identified under federally approved state wildlife action plans. This bold investment in our nation's wildlife will pay significant dividends. It will allow states to take proactive action that will prevent the at-risk species from becoming endangered. Additionally, 10% of the funds in the legislation will go towards threatened and endangered species, which aids in the recovery efforts of those at most at risk iconic, and we're going to keep talking about that number more. The broad group of stakeholders supporting the Recovery in America's Wildlife Act underscores the need for action and support for this approach. It is a diverse bipartisan group. Leading conservation organizations, sportsmen's groups, businesses of all sorts support the legislation for good reason. It utilizes proven funding mechanisms, boldly addresses pressing conservation needs, and prevents the need for more costly interventions in the future. We have received letters of support from a bipartisan group of 6 great governors, as well as groups like the Congressional Sportsman Foundation and countless tribal organizations, and I would like to ask unanimous consent to put them in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. I want to tell you about something I did last week. If you had asked me if I was ever going to do this, especially with the person I was with, I think I won't tell you who I was with. But for 3 hours, we kayaked the Rouge River, 50 years after it had caught on fire. We passed the Ford Rouge plant, AK Steel, DTE Energy. It's a total industrial area. And yet we saw bald eagles. We saw Rashida Tlaib, now I just told you, got the most beautiful picture. I know, it's just, I could, of a turtle. I couldn't get the turtles. Everything that we saw, the sturgeon were out there, the woodpeckers, the butterflies. I even saw a snake fox, which is endangered, but I want to service. But it shows what happens when we pull together. It was the most incredible 3 hours I've ever had. We have a conservation, economic, and moral rationale to act in order to protect and recover America's wildlife for future generations. It's an opportunity for all of us to work together to take historic action to address a pressing conservation need. And I just want to work with everybody on this committee to do something to preserve our precious natural resources. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Tinkle. And now we'll recognize Mr. Byer for 5 minutes to tell us about the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act. Welcome back to the committee.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Chairman Jared Huffman and Ranking Member Tom McClintock for inviting me to testify on the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act. This is bipartisan. The co-lead is Representative Vern Buchanan from Florida, and Senator Tom Udall has been leading the effort in the Senate. This bill comes at a critical moment, especially considering the United States report on the accelerated species extinction rates. According to the report, 1 million plant and animal species are on the verge of extinction, which comes with alarming implications for human survival. In fact, more plants and animals are threatened with extinction now than at any other period in human history. Scientists have found overwhelming evidence that human activities, including deforestation, overfishing, pollution, and more, are behind nature's decline. So we're destroying the core of our livelihood, food, health, and economy. If we don't act now, we're in grave danger. And one of the greatest threats to species survival and diversity is the loss, degradation, and fragmentation of natural habitats. America's landscapes are becoming biologically unproductive and unhealthy because native habitats have become islands and are unable to sustain vital natural resources such as dispersal, migration, genetic exchange, acquisition of resources, population stability, and climate adaptation. And many of America's most beloved species, from the Florida panther to the pronghorn antelope to the monarch butterfly, are under threat due to this fragmentation of their habitats. Climate change, of course, is causing plants to shift in elevation and location, coastal waters to warm, and coastal habitats to erode due to sea level rise and land subsidence. Conserving, restoring, and establishing new ecological connections to facilitate the shift of species are key climate adaptation strategies. The Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act would give these species a fighting chance at survival. This bill ensures that native wildlife can continue to migrate, adapt, and thrive in the face of increasing threats to their population and habitats by granting authority to the Secretary of Interior to designate national wildlife corridors on federal lands that the U.S. public already owns. It establishes a wildlife movement grant program to fund conservation efforts and improvements on state and tribal lands and those of voluntary private landowners to encourage natural wildlife movements. There's nothing in here that's eminent domain taking land away from landowners. The bill directs federal agencies to collaborate with state, tribes, local governments, and landowners. It's a really big emphasis on working with state and local governments to identify and manage these wildlife corridors. This is not going to be done from the federal government, but at the state level. It also creates a shared scientific wildlife connectivity database to inform decision makers as they make land management choices. Maintaining the routes animals need to move will sustain wildlife populations, support wildlife-based recreation like hunting and fishing, and avoid conflicts with businesses that depend on public land resources. Let me emphasize that this is to avoid conflicts with those businesses that the ranking member was concerned about. Further, wildlife corridors are cost-effective and promote public safety. Each year, estimated 1.5 million large animals, just look at deer in Northern Virginia, are killed on our roadways, costing approximately $10 billion. That's order of magnitude greater than the money we're talking about spending to help build these corridors per year. Wildlife road crossings, including underpasses, overpasses with fencing, have been shown to reduce wildlife collisions by an average of 85%. It's got bipartisan support around the country and in Congress. In 2008, the U.S. Forest Service, under George W. Bush, working with the state of Wyoming, private landowners, sportsmen, and conservation organizations, established the nation's first federally designated wildlife corridor to protect a century-old migration route for pronghorn. Today, the path of the pronghorn, that's in capital letters, conserves one of the most longest remaining terrestrial mammal migration corridors in North America. And this year alone, 11 states introduced and 3 actually passed wildlife corridor legislation: New Mexico, New Hampshire, and Oregon. So it's got broad public support. There was a 2019 poll by the National Wildlife Federation that showed overwhelming support for the wildlife protection of the migration. 84% of respondents in Colorado and New Mexico said they'd like to see increased efforts. So the science is clear. 180 scientific studies have shown that maintaining habitat connectivity is key components for the survival of wildlife species. Leading scientists, especially Harvard's E.O. Wilson, stress the importance of wildlife corridor protection. A new report based on decades-long research in Science magazine finds that connecting habitats also has long-lasting ecological effects. So we need this legislation now more than ever. Thank you for inviting me to participate. And I'd like to enter, if there's no objection for the record, letters of support from many different people, 200 national organizations, Patagonia, Petzl Foundation, Secretary Zinke's secretarial order on wildlife corridors, the Western Governor Association's 2019 resolution protecting wildlife migration corridors, and the public poll by the National Wildlife Federation.
Without objection, they will be entered into the record. Thank you,
Mr.
Mr.
Chair.
Byer.
I yield back.
Thank you very much. We will now hear from our panel of witnesses. We've combined 2 panels into one to move us along a little more quickly. And I will briefly introduce the witnesses. First, we will hear from the administration. Mr. Stephen Guertin is the Deputy Director for Policy at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Welcome, sir. You will be our first witness. We will then hear from Ms. Gloria Tom, who is the Director of the Navajo Nation's Department of Fish and Wildlife. Next will be Mr. Colin O'Mara, President and CEO of the National Wildlife Federation. And we will then hear from Ms. Marnie Urso, the Policy Director at Audubon Great Lakes. And then finally, our last witness will be Ms. Jennifer Fielder, the CEO of the American Lands Council. Let me remind the witnesses under the committee rules, they are to limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but your entire written statement will appear in the hearing record. When you begin, of course, the light will be green. At the 1 minute to go mark, it will turn yellow, and of course, when it turns red, it's time to wrap up. I will also allow the entire panel to testify before we bring it back to members of the committee for their questions. The chair now recognizes Mr. Guertin for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member McClintock, and members of the subcommittee. We appreciate the opportunity to testify before you today on H.R. 2795, the Wildlife Conservation Corridors Act, and H.R. 3742, the Recovering America's Wildlife Act. Our mission is working with others to conserve, protect, and enhance fish, wildlife, and plants and their habitats for the continuing benefit of the American people. In particular, we work side by side with our colleagues in our state fish and wildlife agencies. We appreciate the subcommittee's interest in the service's important mission. Our written testimony discusses our views on these 2 bills, and I'll briefly summarize them for you now. H.R. 2795 would create a national wildlife corridor system on federal lands and waters that would be managed by the relevant secretaries of jurisdiction, as well as a tribal wildlife corridor designation program that is voluntary for tribal participation. Under this bill, a grant program would be established to provide funding for wildlife corridor management on non-federal lands and waters. The grants would enhance habitat connectivity and support movement of wildlife across landscapes. Habitat loss and fragmentation are among the most important threats to biodiversity. The continued viability of many wildlife populations is dependent on the continual ability to move. This includes daily movement by wildlife populations among local resources, migrations between seasonal ranges, long-range dispersal supporting gene flow, and species range shifts over time in response to changing conditions. The service manages a network of 567 national wildlife refuges with at least one refuge in each U.S. state and territory. Wildlife refuges are vital to connecting and maintaining wildlife corridors for birds, fish, and mammals. Many refuges partner with neighboring landowners to facilitate passage of wildlife across the mosaic of public and private lands between refuges. The department has taken steps to further efforts to conserve wildlife corridors. In 2018, the Secretary of the Interior issued Secretarial Order 3362 to improve habitat quality in western big game, winter range, and migration corridors for antelope, elk, and mule deer. The Secretarial Order fosters improved collaboration with states and private landowners. It ensures that science drives habitat connectivity and conservation activities of our state partners to address the highest priority habitats. Voluntary and non-regulatory landscape conservation has been a successful approach across the country. Several provisions in H.R. 2795 emphasize this collaborative approach. We welcome the opportunity to work with the subcommittee to ensure any corridor legislation complements and does not defer existing work of the service and our sister bureaus and our state partners as we continue to work with states and other partners to improve the habitat conditions in migratory corridors. Regarding H.R. 3742, the service supports the intent of the Recovering America's Wildlife Act and notes the potential budgetary impacts the bill would require further analysis. The bill proposes to redirect $1.3 billion annually from existing revenue in the General Treasury Fund to states and territories for fish and wildlife conservation and $97.5 million for tribal fish and wildlife conservation. The service applauds and supports state and territory conservation efforts as well as tribal efforts. The states and territories are critical partners in the effort to conserve our nation's natural resources. They develop state wildlife action plans which provide a roadmap for conservation within their jurisdiction before species and their habitats become too rare or costly to restore. The funding provided for the bill allows for increased opportunities to engage in non-consumptive, wildlife-dependent recreation, which is a big component of the outdoor recreation industry. Participants in wildlife watching activities spent a total of almost $76 billion. The last year's statistics are available, 2016, with almost $12 billion spent on food, lodging, transportation, and $55 billion on equipment purchases, etc. Investing in species and habitat conservation reduces threats to these species before they become critically imperiled. The service appreciates the subcommittee's interest in furthering wildlife conservation in the United States and across the globe. We stand ready to work with the subcommittee as you consider these and other fish and wildlife conservation and management bills, and we would be happy to answer any questions from members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Appreciate that, Mr. Guertin. Thank you. Ms. Tom, welcome to the committee. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and good afternoon, Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member McClintock, and distinguished members of the Subcommittee on Water, Oceans, and Wildlife. My name is Gloria Tom, and I'm the Director of the Navajo Nation's Department of Fish and Wildlife. The Navajo Nation is located in the Southwest and is the largest Indian tribe in the United States. Tribal nations have been blessed with a diverse array of fish and wildlife, many of which are biologically and culturally important to tribes. While some species are thriving, many more are facing increasing challenges and are in steep decline. The Navajo Nation's Department of Fish and Wildlife consists of a well-established comprehensive wildlife management program that encompasses big game, fisheries, wildlife law enforcement, and endangered species management. Many tribes have similar management programs. In addition to managing wildlife for biological and scientific purposes, we as natives also manage our wildlife for spiritual, cultural, and traditional purposes. A large part of the native way of life is centered on wildlife. As such, tribes have taken intelligent, creative, and responsible co-management of our fish and wildlife and plant resources very seriously. There are countless stories that exemplify excellent wildlife management, a few of which are outlined in my written testimony. Tribal nations like the Navajo have developed innovative programs despite a long history of being underfunded and excluded from federal funding opportunities. For example, tribes are not eligible to receive federal funding through the Pittman-Robertson-Dingell-Johnson programs, whereas state fish and wildlife agencies do. This is despite the fact that tribal lands and waters are used to justify state allocations. Since 2003, only $60 million has gone to tribes through the Tribal Wildlife Grants Program that was created by Congress, a mere fraction of what is needed. These grants are competitive and they basically result in tribes competing against each other for funding. I've seen this problem firsthand as director of the Navajo Nation Department of Fish and Wildlife. We are responsible for managing wildlife on 18 million acres of land. As of fiscal year 2019, funding allocations to our department equated to approximately 20 cents per acre. For context, the state of West Virginia, a state with a comparable land base, received $2.86 per acre. Consequently, our department is grossly underfunded and understaffed. That's why the passage of the Recovering America's Wildlife Act is so important. The tribal title would provide $97.5 million in dedicated funding for tribal nations. If passed, the Navajo Nation will be able to establish an invasive species management program and an information and education program while also improving our outdoor recreation facilities and technical capabilities. Tribal nations have worked for many years to ensure a tribal title was added to this legislation, and now that it is included, tribes are enthusiastically supporting its passage. The title was developed to reflect critical issues facing tribes, such as ensuring long-term, stable, and consistent funding that acknowledges tribal sovereignty and Indian self-determination. As of this week, over 60 tribes have provided support letters endorsing the tribal title. The Native American Fish and Wildlife Society and the affiliated tribes of Northwest Indians have also passed resolutions supporting the bill. Finally, I want to make a couple of points about the other reason we are here today, the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act. Nationally, tribes have exhibited leadership in identifying and maintaining the pathways wildlife and fish need to move through the landscape to migrate, breed, and find food, water, and cover. The Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act will support the work tribes have been doing and provides federal recognition of tribal wildlife corridors nominated by tribes. Designation of tribal corridors will enable tribes to apply for funding through the Wildlife Management Grants Program established in the bill. This bill also addresses one of the main challenges facing migratory corridors: coordination across federal agencies, states, and private landowners. With passage of these two bills, Congress has the opportunity to provide much-needed funding to the 573 federally recognized Indian tribes across the country that have wildlife management responsibilities on tribal lands. These two pieces of common sense legislation will streamline the work already happening on the ground and will provide a foundation necessary for tribal nations to protect wildlife. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Tom. Mr. Amari, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member McClintock. On behalf of the National Wildlife Federation, our 6 million members, our 52 state affiliates, it's just an honor to be with you today. Today's hearing comes at a crucial time. And this may be the beginning of the most important congressional conversation on wildlife in the last 45 years. America's wildlife is in crisis. And you've heard report after report, you've had witness after witness talk about this, whether it's the report we put out last year talking about the 1/3 of species in the US that are in trouble, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystems that talked about the 1 million species globally that are in trouble, or the report just a few weeks ago from In Science talked about the 3 billion birds that we've lost in population health just here in North America since 1970. These are the proverbial canary in the coal mine. That's what we're seeing right now. And we're seeing the collapse of species big and small. We're seeing the collapse of big species like moose and caribou, smaller species like grassland birds, frogs and bats, many invertebrates like native bees, monarchs, butterflies, freshwater mussels. And the causes are many. There's habitat loss, degradation, fragmentation. We're seeing disease, invasive species, a rapidly changing climate. We're in the midst of the sixth extinction, as the chairman said, and it affects all sizes and all types of species in all corners of the U.S. But here's a silver lining. We can do something about it. We can actually fix it. The U.S. has led the world in the conservation of the species that we hunt and fish. The North American model of wildlife conservation, which combines scientific management with a user pay model and collaboration among the state agencies, federal agencies, conservation partners, landowners, has helped restore populations of deer, pronghorn, bighorn sheep, wild turkeys, waterfowl, the list goes on. And in fact, the most recent science report that talked about the 3 billion birds actually showed that as bird populations were declining, the bright spot in that report was that duck and geese populations, waterfowl populations, went up by 56%. Now, why is this? This is a direct result of combining collaborative efforts with dedicated funding for wetland conservation through the Federal Aid and Wildlife Conservation Act, Pittman-Robertson, the duck stamp, innovative programs like NACA, innovative programs like in the Farm Bill, and common sense protections under the Clean Water Act and the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. We've enjoyed some incredible successes as well, recovering iconic species, the big species that we care about, things like the bald eagle, the Yellowstone grizzly, the alligator, American alligator, brown pelicans, peregrine falcons, the Louisiana black bear. So we face a choice right now. Do we maintain the status quo and watch species continue to decline and try to prevent their extinction primarily through regulation and litigation, or do we choose a different path? Do we choose a path that's going to catalyze unprecedented collaborative conservation, that's going to proactively restore ecosystems, and it's going to try to recover species through collaboration in every corner of the country? That's what the bipartisan Recovering America's Wildlife Act does. That's what the leadership of Congressman Fortenberry and Congressman Dingell is bringing to the table with more than 139 of their colleagues as of today. They're proposing a visionary, collaborative solution that matches the magnitude of the crisis that we're facing. And the premise of the bill is simple. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. That we can save species and save money in the long run through proactive collaboration before species need more restrictive and expensive emergency room measures. We know exactly what to do. Every single state is already mandated by Congress to develop a state wildlife action plan, and that identifies clear strategies for how to recover species of greatest conservation need. But these plans are basically an unfunded mandate. Right now, it's about $60 million spread across all 50 states. The bipartisan Recovering America's Wildlife Act will change this by dedicating $1.3 billion towards collaborative conservation efforts, including $97 million for the tribes. It'll help save the 12,000 species of greatest conservation need, including listed species, by implementing these state wildlife action plans. The Recovering America's Wildlife Act is quite simply the most significant piece of wildlife legislation since the passage of the Endangered Species Act 46 years ago. It marks the best chance that we have to win our race against the clock. The longer we wait to act, the more expensive and the more difficult this crisis will be able to resolve. The second bill you have before you today is the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act, sponsored by Mr. Byer and Mr. Buchanan. One key to saving species is making sure we increase the abundance and reconnecting their habitat. For wildlife to thrive, they need to make sure wildlife can move across fragmented spaces. They need water and food. They need to make sure they can mate. They need to make sure they can rear their young. Unfortunately, this habitat is often bisected through roads, fences, energy facilities, housing, other barriers. This legislation actually begins to get at this issue in a couple ways. It proposes a voluntary competitive grants program that supports private landowners as well as state and federal agencies. It proposes a voluntary non-regulatory process for identifying priority pathways that we should be more careful about and pinch points. It'll help species from Florida panthers to monarch butterflies. It'll help wildlife to migrate and disperse with changing seasons, boost biodiversity, resilience, and safeguard genetic material as species are trying to adapt to a changing climate. The very last thing I'd like to say is that it's not too late to save America's wildlife. The greatest ally of extinction is inaction. By acting today, we can ensure that our children and grandchildren inherit the full symphony of birds, streams that are teeming with fish, grasslands dotted by herds of pronghorn and mule deer. That's a legacy we can be proud of. Thank you so much for the opportunity to testify. We have an opportunity to do something incredibly bipartisan, incredibly smart right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Amara. Ms. Urso, welcome to the committee. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member McClintock, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to be here today to speak on behalf of the National Audubon Society. Audubon's mission is to protect birds in the places they need today and tomorrow. We have 1.7 million members, 450 chapters across the country. My name is Barney Urso. I'm the Great Lakes Policy Director, which is a regional office of the National Audubon Society. It's a particularly poignant moment to speak to you today about the importance of conservation. 2 groundbreaking studies recently published send the clearest picture yet of the urgent need to invest in the conservation of birds. First, a major new study that has already been referenced, released last month, found that since 1970, North America has lost 3 billion birds. That's 1 out of every 4 birds. The declines are even seen in many of our backyard birds, which are common, like blue jays or orioles. But more than half of our grassland birds are gone, and in the case of the eastern meadowlark, 3 out of every 4 are gone. And today we have 1 billion fewer birds in our forests. Further, just last week, Audubon released a report on the impacts of climate change to the future of birds and found that 2/3 of our birds are at risk in North America. That's 389 species. That includes state birds in California, in Georgia, in New Jersey. As these declines accelerate, we lose out on the tremendous value that birds themselves provide to our communities. They're pollinators, they're seed dispensers, they're mosquito eaters. There are 46 million people in the United States that watch birds. That's 1 in every 5 adults. And it's not only bird watching and hunting that brings joy to people that enjoy birds. They have a huge economic impact. It's a $100 billion industry in bird watching, and it supports 860,000 jobs. Birds are telling us that it's time to take action. We have hope because we know what we have to do. We must advance solutions to address the root causes of climate change, and we must protect the places that birds need today and tomorrow. They have been squeezed out of their ranges by habitat loss. In Ohio, 90% of the wetlands are gone. In Illinois, 99% of the grasslands are gone. Climate change threatens to throw what's left into upheaval and also magnifies ongoing threats. Birds are sentinels for changes happening on our landscape. They are the canaries in the coal mine. To give birds a fighting chance, we need to redouble our efforts in conservation. What we are doing now just isn't enough. As the Blue Ribbon Panel found, states only have 5% of the resources they need to implement the state wildlife action plans. We know conservation efforts can be successful. As was mentioned, waterfowl is one of the only groups of birds that has improved since 1970, and that's a result of dedicated and consistent funding to manage their wetland habitat. Audubon supports the Recovering America's Wildlife Act because we need a bold and bipartisan initiative to address the crisis facing our birds and other wildlife. This dedicated funding would be an opportunity to help meet conservation needs all across the country. These investments in proactive conservation will help bird species that are not yet listed as threatened or endangered, but could be without further action. When a species reaches this point, it's much more expensive and much more difficult to recover, and an ounce of prevention really is worth a pound of cure. The legislation will benefit many species in the Great Lakes, including the Kirtland's warbler, which was recently delisted from the endangered species list. Maintaining their population, making sure they don't end up back on the list will depend on sufficient funding. Other species that could benefit include marsh birds, such as the black tern, and grassland birds, such as the northern bobwhite and Henslow sparrow. Audubon also supports the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act. While we think of big game, wildlife migration corridors are also vital to birds who make use of the same lands to nest in, to winter, and to stop over while they migrate. Additionally, we recognize that these bills are only a piece of the puzzle. To address widespread threats, we will need a broad suite of solutions, including upholding environmental laws such as the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. Wildlife conservation is underfunded. Audubon is eager to work with this committee and stakeholders on ways to support the recovery of threatened and endangered species, especially for states that have the greatest needs. We have a window of opportunity in front of us right now, but it is closing. The longer we wait to address this crisis, the more expensive it becomes and the less natural heritage we have to leave for our children and our grandchildren. America's birds and wildlife and the places they need to survive are highly valued by the vast majority of Americans, and they are worth investing in. Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Urso, thank you. Ms. Fielder, welcome. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for inviting me to testify on behalf of the American Lands Council, America's advocate for better access, health, and productivity on public lands. My name is Jennifer Fielder, and I live in beautiful Northwest Montana. Here we go. And there's some pictures of it. I've got plenty of slides, so please follow along. I live in beautiful Northwest Montana, where, like most Montanans, I enjoy the outdoors almost every day. I also serve in the state senate and chair our fish and game committees. My district includes millions of acres of federally controlled lands. Federal policies affect the people closest to these lands and our environment in deeply profound ways. I'd like to call your attention to this map. The red on the map shows all the federal lands, an astounding 640 million acres. Half of all the land in the western United States is controlled by Washington, D.C. Most of the people who pass the laws affecting Western lands don't even live there. This great imbalance isn't fair, it isn't constitutional, and it isn't working. For example, you see this forest. There's a property line there in the middle. The left half of the forest is federally controlled. The right side is locally controlled. The federal half is dead, diseased, and dying. Fire risk is high, and it is a liability economically, socially, and environmentally. In contrast, the right side is locally controlled. It's an actively managed working forest that has been selectively logged from time to time. The fuel loads have been reduced, the forest is healthier, and the fire risk is lower. This is a close-up of a typical hands-off, don't-touch federal forest. The overgrown vegetation is so thick the trees have literally choked each other to death, supplying the type of dead, dry timber perfect for catastrophic wildfires. When we review the number of acres burned on federal lands, in all western states over the last 100 years, we see that less than 1 million acres burned per year in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s when logging, grazing, and access were prevalent. But as over-restrictive federal policies have passed, fuel loads have increased dramatically. Now we are seeing a burn rate of somewhere around 8, 9, even 10 million acres per year. This sad legacy of counterproductive federal law is a leading factor in the destruction of our environment and the threat to our wildlife that is the most overlooked factor that you have today. If you think climate change is causing all of this, please think again. Lack of active management is a huge factor. When charting the long-range plan for the national forests, the U.S. Forest Service actually selects options which, in their own words, limit their ability to respond to fire, wind throw, insects and disease, and to provide timber or other commodities. These types of federal plans, which thwart the agency's very reason for being, are common and are a direct result of over-restrictive federal policies. And because of plans like this, in the last 30 years, the federal government has reduced timber harvest by 70%, eliminated thousands of miles of access roads and trails, and allowed federal lands to become overgrown and inaccessible, feeding the spread of massive wildfires. This new Wildlife Corridors bill may be the most devastating legislation ever, as it will tie up federal lands and waters like we have never seen before, further compounding the regulatory nightmare that for decades has been increasingly producing dirty air, polluted water, decimated wildlife, blocked access, and economically devastated, depressed, unsafe communities. To make matters worse, the feds have repeatedly blocked state fire crews from putting wildfires out. Over-restrictive federal policies threaten our homes, habitat, and communities, fill our air with deadly toxins, and cause millions of animals to be burned alive every single year. This little bear cub was saved. This beautiful buck wasn't so lucky. Neither was this mountain lion. And if these big animals weren't able to escape, what do you think is happening to all of the small ones? Instead of catastrophic wildfires, polluted water, and decimated wildlife, there is a better path. If you really want to protect the environment, free the lands from federal bureaucracy, don't pass these bills. Start passing legislation that transfers control of our lands to the states so that we can actually manage the lands for access, health, and productivity that makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. Reminding the members that the committee rule 3D imposes a 5-minute limit on questions. I will recognize myself first, and then we will move forward with other questions. I just want to make a statement. I want to thank you all for being here, number one. Secondly, particularly Audubon, I'm familiar with all your organizations, most familiar with the Audubon because I live in Cape May County, New Jersey, and there's a great deal of involvement there. The loss of birds, is there any one particular, focus, reason, that this has happened? It's so significant and so surprising, to be quite frank. I thought there would be, possibly a loss of numbers, but it's pretty extreme. And is there any sense, is that going to continue? Is it going to accelerate? Where are we going to be with this? And actually, you can all answer that. We can start with the Audubon.
Thank you for your question. So the 3 billion bird study was looking backwards at losses. They didn't delve deeply into reasons. There's a number of reasons, from habitat loss, pollution, development, that continues to be threats as we move forward. Our report finds that climate change is the biggest threat to birds in the future, so that is our number one issue right now, but we need to continue to address and protect the places they need. So that's why we are in support of the Recovering America's Wildlife Act, because it's going to give states the resources they need to implement the conservation plans for the species at greatest risk. So that is a great path forward to ensure that birds have the places that they need today and tomorrow.
Thank you. Mr. Gerton, same question.
We, too, have taken that study, taken a look at it. The Fish and Wildlife Service works very closely with our state counterparts. We have a number of federal and state programs where we can deploy a lot of resources to get ahead of the decline we've seen in some bird species. Other witnesses have talked about the power of our work with migratory waterfowl under the North American Waterfowl Management Plan, the joint ventures, a lot of habitat restoration there as well, and certainly our capacity that we can deploy on the National Wildlife Refuge System, and then a number of the grant programs that we can partner with the states and private landowners on getting ahead of some of the habitat loss that we're seeing.
Thank you. Ms. Tom?
In regards to the declines on the Navajo Nation, there are many reasons. One of the major reasons is we're located in the Southwest, and we have we're experiencing tremendous impacts from climate change. A lot of our species are shifting or declining in numbers, and we're also dealing with encroachment of habitat by development. And my department is responsible for trying to coordinate development at the local level with our communities, and knowing where the data where fish and wildlife are occurring. We're trying to coordinate that development very, very carefully, but a lot of it is due to climate change.
Okay, thank you. Mr. O'Mara, and I'm going to ask you one additional question along with that quickly, is do you, from the scientific information that you've seen, everything that we've observed, is there an ability to recover with the continuation of climate change and the other issues that exist?
Yeah, no, thank you for the question, and thanks for all the work you've done with New Jersey Audubon, our state affiliate. Eric Stiles and those guys love working with you. We're not at the point of no return yet. We've seen this repeatedly, right? When we've focused on species, whether that's game species like wild turkeys or deer, or we focused on endangered species like bald eagles or peregrines, it's not too late. A lot of it is habitat, though. I mean, we have to focus on habitat. It's restoring good habitat. It's removing invasives. It's addressing disease. It's reconnecting habitat. And the places where we've been most successful as a country have been places where we had a lot of collaboration. And so now is the time, though. I mean, the thing that's scary about the birds report is that the precipitous decline is actually accelerating right now. So if we don't get ahead of it now, at some point we'll face a point of no return.
Thank you. Ms. Fiedler, same question, especially in consideration that you have such a different viewpoint. And you have about 50 seconds.
Thank you,
Thank
Mr.
you.
Chairman. Well, it's obvious that the best, most foolproof science is science that can be observed directly. Ground truth, the science. And you can see on the ground that these federal fires are destroying more animals than any other factor out there. So this bill isn't really about protecting wildlife. It's about these organizations getting more money, plain and simple. That's what it's about. They're here because the grant programs, the money. I'm here because I really care about the wildlife, and I want to see us enact policies that actually protect the environment for the right reasons.
Thank you very much. I will now recognize Mr. Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here today, and I want to thank my friend from Nebraska and a friend from Michigan for making some changes to this legislation related to the funding stream. Previous versions of this bill was connected. The funding stream was connected to offshore energy revenues from energy production, particularly off the state that I represent, the state of Louisiana, which caused great concern here. So I do want to thank the authors of this bill for delinking that. But I want to ask a question. Mr. O'Mara, you made mention in your oral testimony that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And I couldn't agree with you more. And you historically have been supportive of some of the efforts in Louisiana to help to restore and protect the coastal Louisiana ecosystem that has lost about 2,000 square miles of coast. And I think I could basically cut and paste virtually all of your testimony about wildlife and apply it to the productive estuary that we have in the coast of Louisiana. I've been a bit frustrated in this committee because we're moving bills to fund all sorts of other things. And it seems like that coastal Louisiana has been on the back burner despite this committee passing unanimously last Congress improvements in revenue sharing that under our state's constitution, not laws, constitution, is committed to ecological restoration, community resilience. Can you help me perhaps explain to people back home sort of where that fits on a priority list? We're doing all these other things. Do you believe that the restoration, the resiliency, the protection of that coastal ecosystem should be a priority, is a priority?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, you and I have been working on this a long time together. And I think a lot of folks in other parts of the country don't realize the rate of change in Louisiana and in the Gulf. You look at the habitat loss, it is a national crisis. I mean, there's places, whether it's in Louisiana or places, in Florida. I mean, there's kind of that region. It does have to be a national priority, and we're going to have to invest in the restoration. And frankly, to Mr. Van Drew's question about reaching a point of no return, if we don't make some investments sooner rather than later and implement some of the master plans, we're not going to be able to get it back. You just have open water where wetlands used to be.
Mr. O'Mara, when you look at the repercussions of climate change, you look at sea rise and some of the projections that are out there. I believe Louisiana is the canary in the coal mine in that we have some of the fastest subsidence or sinking rates in the world. You add that with sea rise, your relative sea rise rates are again, just extraordinary and some of the greatest ones in the world. What kind of message does this lack of action send to communities like Mr. Van Drew represents, the chairman represents, the states that Mr. McClintock represents, some of these coastal states? What kind of message does it send to them? If this is going to be the precedent, this is going to be the canary in the coal mine, and the federal government completely sits on the sidelines.
Yeah, I mean, it gets scary. And the only state that's subsiding faster than yours is mine, in Delaware. So, I mean, I do think that natural resources have been dramatically underinvested in for decades by this body, both Republicans and Democrats. If we don't figure out ways to make some of these investments to make communities more resilient, we're going to see all kinds of folks in harm's way, all kinds of public safety, economic crises across the country. So if we don't help places like Louisiana, places like Delaware, all of a sudden we're not going to have a second chance to help some of those communities before it's too late.
If you're a conservative and perhaps care about the budget implications, is it fiscally conservative? Is it smarter for us to wait for hurricanes and disasters to happen, or does it make sense for us to lean forward and address it on the front end?
Yeah, right now, like we talk about the $22 trillion debt. It's a huge number. We're not factoring in any of the disaster costs that are coming. Those $200, $300 billion supplementals that you're passing every year are not factored into that at all. It is 1/10 the cost. It's 10 times cheaper to invest in proactive mitigation than it is to do storm response after the fact. We are incredibly penny wise and pound foolish right now.
Thank you. Ms. Urso, similarly, your organization, we've worked extensively with your organization over the years on sustainability of coastal Louisiana. We just met this week with representatives of your organization about the impact on birds projected moving forward, the loss of species. Louisiana being one of the most important migratory flyways in the continent, excuse me. Would you like to comment at all? And I've got many statements from both of your organizations. You've said in the past, perhaps, on the priority of the restoration and protection of coastal Louisiana.
Yeah, I mean, I'm from the Great Lakes region, so I think just generally speaking, coastal wetlands are one of the most biologically important habitats in the world, right? And so protecting those, whether it's in the Great Lakes, along coastlines of Louisiana, it's crucial to make sure that we are investing in those. They're carbon sinks, they're sponges, they're kidneys, they filter, they're really climate resilient, and so they're protective of communities, not only for birds and wildlife, but of people, so.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate it. Look, I just want to say that we've passed out of this committee bills to mandate $900 million to Land and Water Conservation Fund from offshore energy revenues, $1.3 billion for maintenance, backlog maintenance per year, each of these per year from offshore and onshore energy revenues. This legislation, which, look, I supported, it's part of a package we did back in the 90s under CARA, but we can't keep doing all these things and not address one of the most productive ecosystems in the North American continent. To hear all of these witnesses talk about the crisis with species and the habitat, it is worse what's happening in Louisiana, and it's a precedent for your state and many others. And we can't keep ignoring what's happening. Yield back.
I admire your intensity, and I really mean that. And not only have we passed these bills, I hope there's a point in time where some of them actually truly get signed into law. Thank you. Mr. Bishop, I recognize you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And Mr. Chairman, and to our witnesses, thank you for being here. I kind of regret that I am here today, but the majority has basically left me no choice. The ranking member's complaints that he asked in the beginning, they have merit to it, and I appreciate what the senator from Montana has also said. There is some merit to all of those. That does not mean necessarily that I dislike any of the bills that are before us. In fact, I'm going to be looking forward to reading the transcript since I was called out of what your testimonies actually were, and I think there's some areas in which we can get some kind of agreement. I do appreciate the administration's position. If I actually knew what the position was, it would be nice. 3 weeks ago at a markup, I spoke about the unwillingness of this committee and especially the committee's staff to move a backlog bill that right now has 318 House co-sponsors, including 18 of the 25 Democrats on this committee. And I said at that time, and I'm going to say it again all the time, that I'm going to drag my feet and oppose any kind of conservation actions that come forward until they commit, Democrats commit to actually putting that bill on the floor and having a vote on the backlog maintenance bill that affects all public lands. Now, ironically, when I spoke fairly angrily about the fact that the House, this committee was sitting on the bill because they said it didn't have a score, the next day, ironically, there was a score. However, that was still the end of September, and today this bill is still in the committee. It still has yet to be transmitted to the House for further action. And now, the fun part about it is that the committee is now saying, well, we need to have some kind of offset. I want to remind you that the backlog bill is not taking revenue away from anything. It's if excess revenue develops, then $1 billion will be put into the backlog for our public lands. If it doesn't develop, then there's nothing to go in there. So what we're talking about is mythological money that doesn't exist right now because we don't have it, we don't use it. But by the rules of the game that we're playing in the House, that still has to score in some particular way. Now, I mention that simply because one of the bills that was mentioned here, and I don't necessarily oppose Ms. Dingell's bill, but one of the bills does take $1 billion a year from existing revenues and existing programs and puts it into this particular program. That is indeed a real score. But in 3742, this is the language that's in the section 104. A, budgetary effects of this act shall not be entered on any pay-go scorecard maintained pursuant to section 4D of the statutory Pay-As-You-Go Act of 2010. B, the budgetary effects of this act shall not be entered onto any pay-go scorecard maintained for the purpose of section 406 of House Concurrent Resolution 71 and the concurrent resolution of the budget for the fiscal year 2018. Now, for those who don't speak wonkish, let me try and translate that. It simply means that that bill has a real score taking real money from the present bill, and it should find an offset, but you have put in provisions in the bill to specifically say it doesn't have to find an offset. You have exempted it from the offset. Yet the backlog bill that has 318 House co-sponsors, you're trying to slow walk and hold it down because you say it has to find an offset from money that's not even there yet. I'm sorry, this is hypocrisy, and that's what is so fundamentally wrong with what this committee's staff is doing. And I'm frustrated, and I'm still upset. So my outrage is not necessarily about the bills, and that's why I really do want to listen to the testimony that's given, because I think there can be a way in which we can actually find some common ground with all of these bills that are before this hearing today. But I am still frustrated with the leadership of the committee and the staff leadership of the committee for simply dragging their feet on something that should not be dragged. It should be there on the floor. It should be voted on now. It's one of the few bills that has, there's only a handful of bills that have over 300 sponsors. This is the only one that hasn't been heard on the floor yet. And it still has a majority of sponsors in the Senate, and it will be signed by the administration. Why in the hell are we still waiting on this particular bill? So I am talking about this issue and every other conservation issue until we put that on the floor for a vote. We are silly. We are playing stupid games, and I'm tired of having this bill held up as some kind of blackmail for something else that's not going to happen. So, Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Without questions for you guys, I apologize because I wasn't here for it. I am looking forward to listening to what you truly said on this. But once again, I am frustrated as hell with this committee and the leadership of this committee and how they are moving on some of these issues. It's just wrong. It is flat out wrong. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Bishop, and I would say that there's lots of things I'm frustrated about every day, but the purpose of today is to have a hearing on these two bills. The purpose of today is to determine the value of these bills, and I would remind everybody that these are bipartisan bills, that there's a tremendous support. And now I recognize...
On whose time is the chairman speaking?
My own, I guess.
You don't have time.
I hear you, I hear you. Mr. McClintock, I recognize you. I actually have you down as next. Mr. Fortenberry?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the time. Thank you for waiving the rules to allow me on the committee. I came last year to testify on this bill, and it was a good experience, and I've noticed there's been some redecoration, and it looks lovely, so thank you for inviting me back. I had hoped that Chairman Bishop wouldn't leave because I wanted to let him hear my part of this vision for what we can do and want to be an active participant in solving the very type of problem he talked about. But let's talk about architecture today and possibilities around this piece of legislation, which I think is highly, highly innovative and potentially very, very effective, the Recovering America's Wildlife Act. In fact, Mr. Chairman, I think this is the single most exciting policy development in the conservation space to come along in decades. And I do want to commend my colleague, Debbie Dingell, for picking up this mantle and working steadily and consistently through many, many ups and downs to try to achieve some working consensus here around, with all of us around the fundamental goals. And, Mr. Chairman, RAWA is really three things. It protects ecosystems, it enhances community, and it supports recreation. Let me give you a little example. A little while back, took a ride up to a place called Pelican Point State Recreation Area with our Nebraska Game and Parks. There's a project there in which some land was reclaimed in order to create spawning grounds for an endangered species, the pallid sturgeon. And it's a complicated project, been a long-term project. We got in a boat, crossed the navigable part of the river, and this area, for its natural beauty, was noted in the journals of Lewis and Clark when they rode through this area themselves. As we got a little closer to the breeding grounds, the boat ran aground, it's shallow water, and I noticed a yellow sign on one of the sandbars. And I couldn't get any closer, so I simply asked them, "What does that sign say?" And they said, "Oh, that's a duck hunter, probably from Iowa, who's already claimed a spot out there." So the point is exactly this. What has happened in this initiative of a partnering program between the state using federal resources? It's protecting an ecosystem in an existing area of river that's used for transportation. It is enhancing the opportunity for community right there. And it is supporting recreation, in this case, hunting. And that's why, exactly why, we have a diverse group of persons from across the political spectrum who are very interested in coming together around this bill. They include those interested in natural security, environmental security, community recreation, sportsmen, hunters, anglers, and bird watchers. All have aligned around this set of concepts. So RAWA helps conservation by funding state wildlife management plans in a more creative fashion, generating tremendous opportunity for enhanced recreation and hunting and protecting necessary ecosystems that are so essential to wildlife. It helps us get in front of the problem of species and habitat loss by moving upstream from the costly, time-consuming, and litigious emergency room procedures, as Mr. O'Mara pointed out, of the Endangered Species Act. So, currently, when something goes wrong, we act. So why not make something go right? Why not move from regulation and litigation to collaboration and conservation? Why not be proactive instead of reactive? Such an approach will save the government huge amounts of resources and be highly beneficial to society while enhancing outdoor opportunity. It's all a winner, Mr. Chairman. Look, I get it. We've got some entanglements here regarding budgetary considerations. But let's don't let that stop us from an innovative, necessary, good, cost-saving proposal that has huge societal benefits, again, enhancing ecosystems, protecting wildlife, and being beneficial to the entire country. So thank you again for the time, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Fortenberry. I recognize Ranking Member McClintock.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Fielder, you pointed out something that I have noticed time and time again in my district in the Sierra. You can literally tell the boundary line between mismanaged federal land and well-managed local and private land simply by the condition of the forests. Now, our friends on the left tell us that this is all climate change. I have to say, I think it very clever of the climate to know exactly where the boundary is between federal lands and local lands. My question to you is this. So they tell us that if we'll just bike to work and stop eating meat, the problem will go away. Is that the case?
Thank you, Mr. McClintock. If we just do some simple math and you look at those federal lands, you look at how many acres are burning, and you figure a conservative amount of animals inhabiting those lands. A couple years ago, we had 10 million acres burned. Say 5 animals per acre.
Yeah, there's nothing more devastating to a forest than a forest fire, and yet because of the constraints placed on our federal forest managers by the Endangered Species Act, by the National Environmental Policy Act, we've essentially consigned our forests to a condition of benign neglect. And as you point out, an untended forest is like an untended garden. It will grow and grow and grow until it chokes itself to death. And now we can see the vivid evidence of that wherever a neglected federal forest abuts actively managed private or public land. Mr. Guertin, when you compare the decrepit condition of our federal lands and see the visible contrast with actively managed private and local land, do you really believe that the path to healthier forests is for the federal government to take over management of still more private and local lands?
No, I don't, Mr. Chairman, but I don't believe this legislation envisions that
Well,
either.
I think the corridor legislation, it envisions exactly that. Do you know the current deferred maintenance backlog for the National Refuge System?
Yes, sir, it's $1.1 billion.
How prudent do you think it is for the Fish and Wildlife Service to support the bills before us here today that will cost U.S. taxpayers billions of additional dollars annually, with a current refuge maintenance backlog sitting at $1.1 billion already? Shouldn't we first take care of the lands and the public facilities that we already own and control that are in need of repair before we spend billions of additional tax dollars to acquire more land?
Congressman, the president's budget always tries to balance those competing needs, taking care of what we have.
Let me ask you this, because I asked this of John Jervis, the chief of the National Park Service under Barack Obama. Given the choice between meeting your maintenance requirements and acquiring more land, which would you prioritize? His answer, under the Obama administration, was take care of the lands we already own first. Is this administration breaking from that position?
No, sir, the administration is continuing to prioritize the backlog's maintenance, but we're also trying to balance that with
Well,
increased
you either
access
are or
and
you aren't,
opportunities.
and that's my concern. Ms. Urso, you mentioned the tremendous loss of birds. We held a hearing on this subject a few months ago, and there was agreement by all of the experts across the spectrum that by far and away the single biggest source of mortality is feral cats. I'm curious, how will this bill deal with the principal cause of bird mortality, cats?
Yeah, I don't, we are looking forward to the impact of climate change to birds is what our report addressed directly in habitat loss.
So how are these bills going to?
Well, this is a conservation bill, so that we are very much
Are
in
you
favor of
going to
empowering
be
the states.
eradicating feral cats with this bill? That is the principal cause of
that's part of
mortality.
this
That's what we
bill.
were told by a wide-ranging panel of experts just a few months ago.
I don't believe that's part of this bill.
Mr. Guertin, regarding H.R. 3742 on Pittman-Robertson, that's funded by an excise tax on firearms and hunting and fishing licenses to maintain habitats for both hunting and fishing. Is the revenue generated by this excise tax growing or shrinking?
It depends on the annual sales, Mr. McClintock.
Well, I know it depends on the annual sales. Is the total revenue rising or shrinking?
It has been rising for the aquatic side of the formula. It has been stable or decreasing for the hunting.
I've been told it's been decreasing.
For
Why
the
is-
hunting and
why is
firearms,
that?
yes, sir.
Why is that?
Just variation in the amount of ammunition that's sold, the
Well, do you suppose it could have something to do with the increasing restrictions on hunting, including a wide range of actions such as road closures throughout our federal lands?
Sir,
Does that have something to do with it?
our secretary is trying to increase access to the refuge
Well,
system and other.
wouldn't it make
public
more
lands as
sense to
well.
reverse these restrictions and encourage the public to return to these pursuits?
It might, sir, yes.
I'd like to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask you to respond to these in writing. Under Committee Rule 3, members of the committee must submit witness questions within 3 business days following the hearing, and the hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for the responses. If there's no further business, without objection, the committee stands adjourned.